Sydney and Perth.
Well, a $12 million television advertising campaign to promote a policy that no one wants, namely a carbon tax, which is dishonestly named. It's a carbon dioxide tax. A policy that's not even in legislation, a policy that's not been before the Parliament. But Julia Gillard said it's the right thing to do, given the amount of misinformation being drummed up. Well, the vehicle of most of the misinformation is Julia Gillard herself. Tony Abbott's right, the Labor Party should pay for these ads, and he's right when he says it's taxpayer-funded propaganda, which doesn't tell the full truth. And the lead up to the 2007 federal election, the then opposition leader Kevin Rudd promised to ban the use of taxpayers' money for political advertising. Mr. Rudd said at the time it was unacceptable for the government to appropriate money that they had taken from taxpayers to conduct their own political advertising campaigns. Now, this is a $12 million campaign, and another $13 million is going to be spent on a public information campaign. And I'm sorry, this is more lies. Kevin Rudd made a specific promise, Julia Gillard was his deputy in 2007, that there would be external vetting of government advertising. On May 19, 2007, Kevin Rudd said, and I quote, "We need to have the politicians no longer controlling taxpayer-funded advertising. It's as simple as that. Governments are entrusted to spend taxpayers' money on essential services, not to use them, that's money, as a re-election war chest." Well, on May 23, 2007, in a doorstop media conference, Kevin Rudd went even further against partisan taxpayer-funded advertising when he said, quote, "This actually is a long-term cancer on our democracy." Now, of course, Julia Gillard talks about the advertising of work choices. Work choices was legislation. Work choices had been before the Parliament. Work choices was in law. The Rudd government made an election commitment in 2007 that there would have to be external vetting of government advertising, and it would only be allowed when legislation was passed or there was an existing budgetary appropriation. None of those things applies here. The government's guidelines for taxpayer money being applied to advertising require that there be extraordinary, their word, or compelling, their word, reasons for government advertising, and that only, and I quote, "policies or programs underpinned by legislative authority, appropriation of the Parliament, or a cabinet decision, which is intended to be implemented during the coloured Parliament, should be the subject of an advertising campaign." The government has introduced no legislation on the carbon tax. There is none. It's never been near the Parliament, and it's never been near the Cabinet. It is a $12 million Clean Energy Future advertising campaign and another $13 million to be spent on a public information campaign for a policy no one wants, in total breach of the government's own guidelines. Kevin Rudd called partisan, taxpayer-funded advertising, quote, "a long-term cancer on our democracy," and it made it clear that such advertising would only be allowed, quote, "when legislation was passed." Well, none of this applies here. We rang the Prime Minister's office seeking an explanation as to why this breach had occurred. We were pushed off to the office of Greg Combay. There seems to be nothing that Julia Gillard won't do in order to hang on to the lodge. But this is a brutal insult to taxpayers. $26 million of taxpayers' money on an advertising campaign for a policy yet to hit the Parliament that taxpayers don't want, and in breach of the government's own guidelines. Julia Gillard's credibility sinks lower and lower.